El gavel tiene que servir para algo. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We were trying to give some time to people that is trying to get in and get in their badges, and as you know, it's not easy. But it's time to start. So again, thank you, excellencies and friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you this year's Prebisch Lecturer, my dear friend and esteemed colleague, His Excellency José Antonio Ocampo, that is the Minister of Finance and Public Credit of Colombia. You know, it has become a cliché in these situations to say that the person we are introducing does not need an introduction. Well, this is especially true today, since I am introducing José Antonio Ocampo to an audience of UNCTAD staff members, Geneva University students, economists all around, trade specialists, and our dear friends, the diplomats from the different country missions that are here with us. This is the equivalent of introducing Gabriel Garcia Marquez to a press club. The truth is that all of us know who you are, José Antonio. We have been reading your work for decades, and we receive you today here at UNCTAD as we receive a friend who has returned home. That said, your reputation, José Antonio, is no excuse for me not to do my job. So I will try my best to introduce José Antonio, who needs no introduction. So the life of José Antonio Ocampo is the life of three men: a public servant in both his own country and in the multilateral institutions, an academic with a long and brilliant career, and finally, Ocampo is like this kind of philosopher and engineer at the same time. I will explain that later. As a public servant, in his own country, José Antonio has been Minister of Finance, Minister of Agriculture, and Director of the National Planning Department of Colombia, among other high-ranking roles. Abroad, he has been United Nations Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. That is when he brought me to the UN. It's his fault. And chair of the Committee for Development Policy of the ECOSOC, among others. As an academic, Ocampo is Latin America's leading economist and economic historian, with a particular focus on economic history of his own country and our region, as well as on development economics, international finance, trade, and the global financial architecture. Ocampo has written over 50 books and hundreds of academic papers. If José Antonio would have brought a copy of every book and paper he has written, we could probably hand a different book to each person in this audience. So, lastly, José Antonio is, as I said, like this philosopher, engineer of economics. As a philosopher, he not only knows all the schools of economics, but also knows them profoundly, aware of their particular histories, geographies, and politics. This combination of breadth and depth has vaccinated Ocampo from the common simplifications many of us are so often subjected to. In the vast library of Ocampo's mind, there is no room for pamphlets. At the same time, why is he an engineer? Because he's capable of taking the most complex organisms that humans have ever invented, which is the current international monetary system, or non-system, as Ocampo likes to call it, and as an engineer, because Ocampo, like few others, has a complete picture of all the moving parts of this tumultuous machine. Parts with often long, obscure, incomprehensible names that we economists like to use. Special drawing rights, capital adequacy framework, rapid financing instruments, and so on. When a crisis hit, Ocampo is never afraid to do both. Look at the problem afresh, but also go back to history to restore and revive all ideas and debates and apply them to current challenges. To him, the global financial architecture is above all unfinished, and he knows, almost better than anyone, which exactly are the parts that are missing. So today, as the world faces a cascade of crises, including pandemics, climate change, trade, geopolitics, inflation, debt distress, this is the sort of out-of-the-box economic thinking that the world needs, that the legacy of Raúl Prebisch celebrates, and that I am sure all of us will witness firsthand in his lecture today. Finally, I can attest to the fact that José Antonio is not only a brilliant economist, but also a kind, value-driven, and generous person. It is an honor to call him a friend, and an even greater honor to have him here with us today to deliver the Prebisch Lecture. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage and in giving him a warm round of applause.
Well, let me start by thanking Rebecca for this overly generous presentation of my career and myself. She has, of course, been a good friend, and she said, I am proud to have brought her to the United Nations. When I was head of ECLAC, I named her the head of the ECLAC office in Mexico and the Central America and the Caribbean, and of course she went on to several other jobs in the UN, including the current one as Secretary General of UNCTAD. Let me, of course, also welcome all of you and thank for being present today in this lecture. Both the current representatives, including the ambassador from my country, Colombia, and all the officials from UNCTAD and other UN organizations in Geneva, and of course, let me say my wife also, who is with me today. When discussing what to talk about today with Rebecca, I came to presented different elements of my own work, and she advised me to give a lecture which has some history. In this case, the history of economic thought, or development thought. So that's exactly what I'm going to talk about today. I call it development debates in historical perspective. So I'll be reading the text and probably stopping at some points to refer to some of the issues I'm going to raise. The concept development was originally thought in a strict economic sense as rising per capita income. Under the United Nations leadership, it came to encompass its social and environmental dimensions. The International Labour Organization developed the concept of basic needs in the 1970s, and the United Nations Development Program that of human development. The environmental dimensions of development were also gradually incorporated and led to a broad concept of sustainable development that in the United Nations terminology includes the economic, social, and environmental dimensions, as incorporated in particular in the Sustainable Development Goals approved in 2015. Development economics was born in the 1940s and 1950s in Eastern Europe and Latin America, the two regions of the developing world that had achieved an intermediate level of development. Paul Rosenstein-Rodin from Poland and Raúl Prebisch from Argentina are clear examples. From the start, it was associated with the broader intellectual economic debates, particularly on the role of the state in economic policy, which had made a push forwards in the 1930s with the Keynesian revolution. The United Nations played an important role in development thinking and in advising developing countries at the time. The Economic Commission for Latin America at the Caribbean was an early leader in this regard, with Prebisch as the intellectual leader. The UN also became the center of debates on the reforms of the world economic system. Since its creation, UNCTAD, also under the leadership of Raúl Prebisch, played a crucial role in this regard. The ideas put forward by the new field of economics took place in a world economy that was already highly unequal in terms of levels of development, and characterized by a division of labor in which developed countries were exporters of manufactures and developing countries of primary goods. This was behind Prebisch's view of the world system as a centered periphery. In his view, and that of Hans Singer, one feature of that system was the tendency of the terms of trade to move against primary goods and thus against developing countries. We should add that the basic conception of classical development economics was the need to industrialize, to accelerate economic growth and technological change. The industrialization consensus, as I have called it, to borrow from the contrasting term which came to be known as the Washington Consensus. In terms of macroeconomic issues, a major topic was how to manage export fluctuations, which were a major source of periodic balance of payment crises in developing countries. Given the strong dependence on the imports of machinery, equipment, and many intermediate goods, the availability of foreign exchange was seen by some classical development economists as a long-term constraint to growth, balance of payment constraint in growth. The strong role of external trade in macroeconomic dynamics of developing countries and the subsidiary role of domestic demand, the issue most underscored by the Keynesian revolution, is what I have to call balance of payment dominance. Again, to contrast with the concept of fiscal dominance that has played a central role in the macroeconomic literature. The 1960s and 1970s led to three significant changes. First, the world economy started to offer developing countries increasing opportunity to export manufactures. This led to an increasing differentiation between those countries that were able to benefit from that trend and those that continue to depend on exports of primary goods. Second, the rise of a new brand of orthodox economics critical of state intervention. It included a strong criticism of import substitution. It was also critical of other forms of state intervention in the financial sector, again, what this school referred to as financial repression. The orthodox views were codified in what we now call the Washington Consensus. The third trend was the return for the developing countries, particularly in the 1970s, of private international capital flows, which had collapsed with the Great Depression of the 1930s. However, the volatility of those flows became a problem of its own and implied a return to boom-bust financial cycles and associated crises. Starting with the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, such volatility became, therefore, a central element of the balance of payment dominance that affects developing countries. The first and the third were part of a globalization process which offered very unequal opportunities to different groups of developing countries, with successful manufacturing exported from East Asia leading the process, but other countries experiencing slower growth, including processes of premature deindustrialization. Globalization also generated crises that involved a large number of countries. The 1997 East Asian crisis that spread to large parts of the developing world, the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2008-2009. By the way, I call this North Atlantic, although it's generally called the global financial crisis, because it was really North Atlantic, US and Europe, not global in a strict economic sense. The COVID-19 crisis, which was perhaps the most global, but its origins are not economic, and was followed by the current crisis. Let me divide my presentation in 4 parts. First, on the issues of the international division of labor and the terms of trade debate, to refer to Prebisch in particular. Second, to the issue of the industrialization consensus. Third, to the topic of macroeconomic dynamics of developing countries and macroeconomic crisis, and therefore to make brief comments on the current crisis. In Prebisch's center-periphery system and the views of Hans Singer, a major characteristic of the world economy was the tendency of the terms of trade of commodities and also developing countries to experience a long-term decline. This represented a major break with the views of classical economics, of David Ricardo in particular, according to which the loss of diminishing returns in primary production and the increasing returns in manufacturing implied that the terms of trade of primary goods will show a long-term improvement vis-à-vis manufactures. The Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, as it came to be called, can be understood as involving 2 different theoretical variants. The first drew on the negative impact that the low income elasticity of demand for primary commodities, and particularly agricultural goods, has on the terms of trade of developing countries. The second, and in my view, a more interesting one, was based on the asymmetric functioning of factor markets in the developed versus developing countries. The fact that the second group of countries face a labor surplus, what in Arthur Lewis' terminology came to be known as the unlimited supply of labor. The fundamental difference between these 2 variants was that in the first case, the downward pressure was reflected directly on the barter terms of trade, whereas in the second, it was generated through factor markets, the factorial terms of trade as they came to be called, and only indirectly through the effects of production costs on commodity prices. Another important difference is that the first variant applied only to primary commodities, where the second variant should affect all goods and services produced in developing countries. Singer posed it very clearly in 1998. The terms of trade between standardized manufactured products produced by developing countries would also tend to deteriorate relative to the innovative products of developed countries. This meant that even though developing countries could industrialize and produce manufactures, the fact that these products were standardized meant that they did not create new economic rents. Instead, the rents associated with innovations were captured by the developed countries' entrepreneurs. The concept of labor surplus fitted well with the complementary terms of trade theory of Arthur Lewis, according to which the international terms of trade were determined by the relative wages in developing versus developed countries, which were determined in turn by levels of productivity in the production of food, of subsistence goods in general in the 2 groups of countries. As pointed out, according to the second variant, the trend in the terms of trade was not associated with the types of goods produced, but rather with the structural characteristics of the countries that produced them. The North-South models developed in the 1980s by Ronald Finlay and Lance Taylor, among others, formalized this analysis. A common feature of this model was that due to differences in economic structures, wage increases in the North were proportional to the rise of productivity, while the unlimited supply of labor implied that real wages were not affected by technological change, which was then exported to the rest of the world through lower prices by developing countries. The expansion of world trade also offers in the 1960s opportunities for diversification of primary good exports towards goods of higher income elasticity to demand and value added. This included manufactured goods, as well as an array of perishables, fruits, vegetables, and flowers, the development of which required special transportation and handling. On top of the now well-established view of the features of the center-periphery system, the literature identifies since the 1980s the risk of Dutch disease, effects of commodity booms, and in particular the deindustrialization process that they could generate. Latin America is the best example of this process. Latin America, by the way, for those who haven't seen the numbers, has more or less the same level, the same share of manufacturing GDP that it had in the mid-20th century. So it's a huge decline in the last 4 years in terms of the share of manufacturing in GDP in Latin America. But also limits the industrialization of sub-Saharan Africa. In relation to the empirical validity of the Prebisch hypothesis, the literature written up to the 1970s was ambivalent. A breakthrough was curiously a World Bank paper of 1988 by Enzo Grilli and Mo Jiang, who showed that there was indeed evidence of a long-term deterioration in real non-oil commodity prices through the 20th century. This paper became a milestone in the debate. The later empirical literature, to which I must say I have contributed quite a bit, has reinforced this conclusion, although indicating also that the adverse terms of trade of commodities was a feature of the 20th century, particularly after World War I, not of the 19th or the 21st centuries. In turn, an adverse trend in the 20th century is largely explained by two downward shifts, one after World War I and the other in the 1980s. In both cases, these adverse shifts represented the late effects of sharp slowdowns in world economic growth. An additional conclusion is that the adverse price trends in the 20th century was particularly strong for tropical agricultural goods. This literature also showed that beyond the short-term fluctuations, there are long-term cycles of commodity prices which last as long as 30 years. On the industrialization consensus, an important implication of the Prebisch hypothesis is that the transmission of technological change in the world economy was relatively slow and uneven. Therefore, industrialization was the principal means at the disposal of developing countries to share in the benefits of technological change, absorb surplus labor from the rural sector, and raise through both of these mechanisms the standard of living of their population. For the intellectual leaders behind the hypothesis, the case for industrialization was broader than the issues associated with the tendency of the terms of trade. In Prebisch's view, it was essential to speed up technological transfer from the center to the periphery, and in Singer's analysis to exploit the strong technological externalities generated by manufacturing. The terms of trade debate may have sidetracked the discussions from what remained for several decades a broader consensus on industrialization. An interestingly parallel discussion was Alexander Gerschenkron's theory of late industrialization of Western Europe. The major challenge required strong state intervention according to his views, but perhaps the industrialization of England also did, according to the research by Ha-Jung Chang. But the challenges are greater for the late industrialization of Latin America and Eastern Europe or Asia, and the late industrialization of sub-Saharan Africa. Industrialization was, of course, a major challenge in many ways as it took place in an unequal world economy. The first was that technology had to be imported, but also that there were learning associated with technological transfers a point strongly emphasized in the 1980s by Jorge Katz and Sanjay Lal. Additionally, imported technology was more capital-intensive than what made sense for the developing world, given their abundant labor supplies and lower wage costs. Industrialization also involved significant linkages among sectors which required policies that could help develop those linkages. It also involved macroeconomic issues, particularly how to finance the long-term capital required by the industrial sector and using export income in order to finance the imports of capital goods. A central element of state intervention to support industrialization in the developing world at the time was protectionism. It had been at the center of US policy since independence, and it became a rule in the last decades of the 19th century in many developed countries and in several politically independent developing countries, particularly in Latin America. In turn, the Great Depression of the 1930s led to the explosion of protectionism worldwide and to the collapse of international trade. In this context, looking at the opportunities that domestic markets provided to encourage industrialization through import substitution was not only natural, but in a strong sense, the only alternative available. The rising anti-colonialist movement in Asia and Africa and the decolonization process that took place in the post-World War years, Second World War years, gave industrialization and protectionism an additional political push in those parts of the world as expression of national self-determination. Furthermore, the reconstruction of world trade after World War II concentrated initially on flows among industrial economies. The opportunities for developing countries, particularly for manufacturing exports, came only in the 1960s and benefited those countries where industrialization was already underway, thanks to import substitution. The idea that the structural transformation of the economies implied industrialization was at the center of the work of Simon Kuznets, and in relation to the development process of that of Hollis Chenery, who became the first chief economist of the World Bank in the 1970s. This institution came to be one of the centers of analysis of this issue, as reflected in the first World Development Report, particularly the second published in 1979 on structural change and development policy. The centrality, I must say, of industrialization for the World Bank at the time was impressive, which later on became also the focus of opposition to the industrialization policies of developing countries. Anyway, I'll come back to this. More generally, the link of industrial development to long-term economic growth became one of the strongest observed regularities in development. The implementation of the industrialization consensus faced, of course, major challenges, some of which have already been mentioned. The first was that technology and the machinery and equipment in which it was embodied had to be imported. An alternative was attracting the firms that control the technology through foreign direct investment. A strong support for domestic firms, including with protection and export subsidies, was a necessary complement in the later case when export opportunities opened up. Additionally, given the capital intensity of imported technologies versus abundant labor supplies, developing countries had to generate dualistic economic structures in which some labor will be employed in the production sectors, in the productive sectors, but a large proportion were left in traditional agricultural activities or were absorbed in a growing urban informal sector. To be successful, industrialization also required the creation of significant linkages among sectors, which generated externalities and required policies to help develop those linkages. This implied that the development process was characterized by major complementarities in wide contrast to the emphasis on substitution, emphasized by neoclassical macroeconomic theory. Albert Hirschman classified the associated complementarities as a mix of backward and forward linkages. The idea that there were strong complementarities gave rise to another series of concepts that came to occupy a central role in classical development debates. The most important were Paul Rosenstein-Rodin Big Push and Ragnar Nusse Balanced Growth. In both cases, the central idea was the need to design a policy package that involved the simultaneous development of complementary industries. In contrast, Hirschman, I must say my favorite development economist, argued that this required developing countries to implement policies that were beyond their capacities. As an alternative, he formulated the view that the development process takes place through a sequence of imbalances, which implied that the policies it required were sequential rather than simultaneous. In his view, imbalances actually played a positive role if they generated policy innovations that induced investments to correct them. The opportunities for export development, particularly from the 1960s, introduced a new element in the development debate. Chenery became in the late 1970s a leader thinker in arguing that the use of those opportunities was an important source of success for the developing world. He claimed that sustained economic growth required transformation of the structures of production compatible with both the evolution of domestic demand and the use opportunities provided by international trade. The call for greater integration in international trade was made in a radical way by the orthodox thinkers, and particularly by his successor in the chief economist of the World Bank, Anne Kruger, who argued that protectionism associated with import substitution policies generated inefficiencies, and particularly an anti-export bias that reduced growth opportunities. Trade liberalization and full integration into international trade was essential for developing countries to accelerate economic growth, according to her views. An interesting contrast was made by the development economists who studied the East Asian export experiences. Ali Samsen argued that export performance generated a reciprocal control mechanism that allowed incentives generated by government policies to be aligned with performance. Her work, as well as that of Ha-Jung Chang and Robert Wade of the East Asian success stories, indicated that, in contrast to Anne Kruger, they were associated with active government development strategies, aimed at diversifying manufacturing exports towards sectors with higher technological content. Therefore, these success stories were export-led, but also involved a strong state encouragement of industrialization. Since the late 20th century, China adopted with a lag similar policies in unequal or even more aggressive ways. The contrast was of the countries that did not and followed the recommendation of the stronger trade liberalization. This led to the experience of premature deindustrialization, particularly of Latin America. The opportunities for export development did not eliminate, therefore, the classical case for industrial policies as part of active industrialization strategies, though they certainly changed the type of industrialization needed. The revival of industrial policies over the past decade or so is behind this way of thinking. My understanding of this issue is that, borrowing from Kuznets, Chenery, and the classical development economics, growth is always a process of structural transformation. A successful policy must be based, therefore, on the dynamic efficiency, understood as the capacity to generate new ways of structural change. This concept is in sharp contrast with the static efficiency, the central focus of traditional macroeconomic and international trade theories. It requires state intervention, but also innovative ways of interaction between the public and private sectors, as emphasized in the recent work of Mariana Mazzucato. The dynamics of production structures may be understood, therefore, as the result of the interaction between two basic forces: innovations, broadly defined as new technologies, new activities, and new ways of doing previous activities, and the learning processes that characterize their full realization and the diffusion through the economic system. The complementarities underscored by classical development economics and the networks of productive activities that they generate, value chains as they have come to be called. The public and private institutions required to enhance this structural process are crucial and also subject to learning. No innovative process is passive. It requires investment and learning. This is an important lesson from the work of Jorge Casas and Jaya Lal. The recent work by Q Lee emphasizes climbing up the ladder in the world hierarchy entails shortening technology transfer periods, taking the tools to manage existing intellectual property rights, and most importantly, gradually becoming a more active participant in technology generation. In the broad terms, it requires national innovation systems to be built up, which should include an institutional framework to coordinate the various actors involved in innovation and learning, research and development centers, universities, extension services, and the innovating firms themselves. And it requires, of course, a strong state interventions in science and technology. Two final comments on global trends are in place. The first is that the ongoing shift away from manufacturers into services is transforming the global economy. The rise of modern services, especially those associated with information and communication technologies, is as essential as manufacturing and has been at the center of successful development experiences. We also know that at high levels of income, the dynamics of services eventually overtake that of industrialization, and that the revolution in ICT has induced major changes in manufacturing itself. These issues, as well as the innovations that take place in primary sectors and value chains in those sectors that were discussed in the previous section, should certainly be at the center of development strategies. There are, of course, other technological waves that are equally important, notably to generate energy that is consistent with global climate change goals, and those that are associated with the new biological technologies and their effects on both medical treatments and agriculture. This is why I prefer to talk about the need for production sector policies and not only of industrial policies, which in a sense focus on manufacturing. The second is that world trade has slowed down significantly since the 2008-2009 North Atlantic financial crisis. To this, we must add the disruptions of value chains generated by the COVID crisis, but also by the new ways of protectionism, particularly between the US and China. All of these have generated both threats to existing trade partners, the effects of which are reshaping globalization. Macroeconomic policy. In the initial stages of development economics, the major macroeconomic issues were the availability of savings to finance investment needed for industrial development and on the foreign exchange required to pay for the imports of machinery and equipment and the intermediate goods that process required. With the return of capital flows and the growing role of domestic private finance, the attention increasingly focused on how to manage the boom-bust cycles in private flows, avoiding also possibly domestic financial and international debt crises. In the debates that characterized the early decades of development economics, the first of these issues involved the management of fluctuations in commodity prices, and from a longer-term perspective, how savings or foreign exchange gaps could affect the growth process. In relation to commodities, an important proposal was the possibility of moderating price fluctuations with the creation of international commodity agreements. Although there were precedents in the 1920s, the creation of commodity agreements became a strong trend in the mid-1950s and early 1960s after the collapse of the commodity price boom that had taken place in the early post-World War II period, with several consumer countries participating in those agreements. The International Coffee Agreement was, for example, a very good example of that trend. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, was created in 1960. But its decision in 1970 to reduce oil supplies, which generated two major price shocks, contributed to the lack of support of consuming countries for commodity prices agreements in general. So these commodity price agreements essentially became irrelevant. I must say I was present as an advisor of the Colombian government on coffee in the collapse of the 1989 of the International Coffee Agreement. It had been revived in different forms, but much weaker than it used to be in the 1960s and 1970s. Domestic stabilization funds are also essential to manage commodity price fluctuations. They save commodity export revenues during price booms to have them available when the succeeding crisis hits. One of their objectives was stabilizing domestic prices, which taxes or forced savings imposed on producers during booms, matched with compensatory subsidies or refund of forced savings during crisis. A good example was the Colombian, and probably one of the earliest examples, was the Colombian National Coffee Fund, created in 1940 to manage domestic effects of the Inter-American Coffee Agreement. The Norwegian Oil Fund is generally recognized today as the best instrument of this kind, but several oil exporting countries have similar instruments. Another good example is the series of Chilean Copper Stabilization Fund, the first of which was launched in 1987. But these stabilization funds are missing in most commodity exporting countries. From a long-term perspective, the essential issue is the possibility that the availability of foreign exchange could become a major constraint on economic growth. A basic issue underscored by classical development economics was the effects of the asymmetry between the high income elasticity of demand for imports by these countries versus the low elasticity of demands for their export goods, particularly for several commodities. Under these conditions, the availability of foreign exchange could become the basic determinant of economic activity. The work of Anthony Thirlwell has been the most influential in the analysis of this issue. This underscored the role of active export strategies and more generally structural diversification plays in overcoming possible foreign exchange gaps. The development of national development banks, as well as public sector investment in new industrial sectors, came to occupy an important place in managing these issues in several developing countries. A central issue today is how to manage capital account volatility. The literature on this topic has identified a sort of hierarchy of volatility of capital flows, with foreign direct investment being the most stable and short-term back lending and portfolio flows the most unstable, according to Danny Roderick and Andres Velasco, among others. In this context, the major risk that developing countries face is the possibility of a sudden stop of volatile capital financial flows, according to Guillermo Calvo, which can generate twin crises, combined external and domestic financial crisis, if the abundance of external financing has generated a parallel boom in domestic financing. The management of external financial cycles requires active countercyclical fiscal and monetary policies. In the first case, the best is the design of fiscal rules that determine the medium-term strategy of the fiscal balance and debt ratios, but allow for deviations around that trend to counteract positive and negative terms of trade shocks to smooth fluctuations in aggregate domestic demand. However, the domestic political economy tends to generate pressures in most developing countries to spend in good times, which in turn limits the policy space to adopt expansionary policies when crises hit. The limited availability and higher cost of financing may also constrain countercyclical fiscal policies during crisis. If austerity policies are adopted as a result, the political pressure to expand during the subsequent upswing in economic activity will be very strong. For these reasons, and in contrast to developed countries, pro-cyclical fiscal policies tend to prevail in developing countries. In the case of monetary policy, countercyclical policies face two major dilemmas. The first one is that if domestic interest rate or monetary aggregates in a countercyclical way, they may increase rather than reduce the volatility of capital flows. That is, bring more capital flow during booms if monetary authorities increase interest rates to reduce domestic demand, and generate more capital flight during crises if they reduce interest rates. For this reason, the recommendation of the traditional macroeconomic literature is to let exchange rates be flexible. Expressed in terms of the trilemma of open economies, in economies with open capital accounts, the authorities can control the exchange rate or the interest rate, but not both. However, this generates a second dilemma because of the negative effects on growth that the appreciation of the exchange rate during booms may generate, both through the reduction of investment in tradable sectors in the short term, but also the unstable incentives generated by the instability of the exchange rate in the long term. In other words, this policy may contribute to the Dutch disease effects of export booms. A growing literature has shown that the long-term growth in developing countries is positively associated with the capacity of the governments to guarantee a competitive and really stable real exchange rate. The limitations that monetary policy faces in open developing countries generate a case against the full capital account liberalization and to actively use regulation to manage the associated volatility. The broad agreement that capital market liberalization generates stronger business cycles in developing countries was supported by a major 2003 IMF study by Eswar Prathat. There is also strong evidence that the broad consensus in the literature that capital account regulations help improve the composition of capital flows towards less reversible flows and provide room for countercyclical monetary policies. The IMF institutional view on capital account management adopted in 2012 accepted that the full liberalization is not always desirable and that regulations can play a positive macroeconomic role to manage capital account volatility. Capital account regulations must be complemented at the domestic level by regulatory policies aimed at avoiding unsustainable credit booms and managing the maturity and currency mismatches in portfolios. The provision of countercyclical financing at the national level is also crucial. National development banks can play a countercyclical role aside from the long-term development goals. In fact, counteracting the procyclical character of private financing at the national level. Finally, some comments on the current crisis. The current crisis has many dimensions, underscored by the concept of the polycrisis, which became, I guess, fashionable with the recent meetings in Davos. I will concentrate on the economic dimensions, but many are associated with the geopolitical tensions, particularly the war between Russia and Ukraine, but also the growing tensions between the US and China. In economic terms, they involve at least 7 effects. First, the remains of the COVID-19 crisis, including because of large inequalities in access to vaccines and the possible effects of the elimination of the Chinese on restrictions to mobility. Second, the mix of inflation and interest rates and the possible recessions, although not quite stagflation. Third, the food crisis in many parts of the developing world, largely generated by the effects of the war in Ukraine, but also to natural disasters associated to climate change. My country is one of those cases, because the floods generated by climate change last year generated massive reduction in agricultural production. So it's the mix of the two, and not only one of them. Fourth, the worldwide rise in interest rate and the rise in risk margins that generated an outflow of capital flows from emerging economies in 2022. Fifth, the high debt ratio generated by the COVID-19 crisis, but also by the high interest rate, which has generated debt crises in many developing and emerging economies. 6, the reversal of climate change policy generated also by the war in Ukraine, as well as the clearly insufficient efforts to adopt policies to reach the climate goals reached in Paris in 2015. 7th, the changes in world trade that are taking place due to the slowdown in international trade, the disruptions of value chain generated by the COVID crisis, but also by new ways of protectionism, particularly between the US and China. To this, we must add the inward orientation of China. In the face of this event, let me end with comments on 3 urgent policy issues. The first one is the need to improve international tax cooperation, improving on the 2021 agreement in the OECD inclusive framework in its 2 dimensions, limiting tax competition and fair taxation of multinational companies. To this, we should add combating tax evasion. Second, the need for countercyclical financing of developing and emerging economies, including in that regard the central role of multilateral development banks. Let me perhaps point out in this regard that the opposition of some countries to capitalize multilateral development banks to finance middle-income countries is a really major constraint today. Let me say that Colombia, which has generally good access to private capital markets, had to rely last year entirely on multilateral development bank financing. So the issue of multilateral development banks and the role vis-a-vis not only low-income but also middle-income countries is an essential issue for the economic debate and for the international cooperation. To this, we need to add that official development assistance must be most active, as well as adequate funds to finance climate change mitigation and development. Third, both permanent institutional frameworks to negotiate public sector debts, but also a new and ad hoc mechanism to manage the current debt crisis. This, of course, is an issue that has been at the center of UNCTAD work. Let me say, first of all, that we need a long-term institution where countries can go and renegotiate debts, which should hopefully be in the United Nations, but I will say could also work in the IMF if the panels associated to that process are independent of the board of the IMF. Let me say, but in any case, that's a very long and complex negotiation, as we know. So that we may need another ad hoc mechanism. But let's say we are full of historically of ad hoc mechanisms, including the Brady Plan for Latin America, the debt rights also for poor countries at the turn of the century, and during this crisis also some of the G20 mechanisms to allow the debt renegotiations of a few poor countries. But we may need an ad hoc mechanism. I have proposed in my writings the idea of a case-by-case ad hoc negotiations intermediated by multilateral development banks as a mechanism that could work on an ad hoc basis. Other people have proposed something like the Brady Plan that was very useful for Latin America after it was implemented after the debt crisis, actually too late at the time. Anyway, but there has to be some mechanism to allow the renegotiations of debt, which is a major issue in a large number of poor countries, but also several middle-income countries. We could add that that globalization is changing both due to the economic and geopolitical events. A major issue, as argued by Danny Roderick, among others, is that it should be more friendly to developing and emerging economies. The rupture of multilateralism is the major constraint in this regard. From this forum, I want to underscore that the United Nations should be at the center of a revitalized multilateralism, both to manage the geopolitical but also the sustainable development challenges well captured in the SDGs, one of the major agreements in world history. Thank you.
Jose Antonio, thank you very much for this remarkable conference and to the force through history and the debates. I want to give the floor first to Her Excellency Ms. Maimuna Tarishi, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the United Republic of Tanzania, on behalf of the Group 77 in China at the 18th Raúl Prebisch Lecture, and after her to Honduras, that will intervene in the name of the GRULAC group. So, Maimuna, first you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Greenspan. Excellency, Mr. José Antonio Ocampo, Minister of Finance and the Public Credit of Colombia, Secretary General, Madam Greenspan, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. The Group of 77 and China would like to thank you, Honorable Minister Ocampo, for a very thought-provoking lecture, worthy of the challenging times that put a strain on the development prospects of many countries around the world. We'd also like to thank the Secretary General of UNCTAD, Madam Greenspan, and her team for gathering us here today and organizing this event. The Raúl Prebisch Lecture, bearing the name of the first Secretary General of UNCTAD, is the forum in which we are able to take a step back from the day-to-day struggles over the language of intergovernmental outcomes and the procedural issues, and instead put on our thinking hats to consider the big development questions of our time. Guided by world-class decision makers and thought leaders such as the one we have the honor to count on today. Honorable Mr. Ocampo, you have raised today a number of issues that take us back to the very purpose for the creation of UNCTAD, namely the recognition of development as not merely an economic process, but one that is directly linked to the political process nationally, regionally, and internationally, and the policies that result from it. Indeed, the pandemic and the interrelated crises have highlighted the role of the state in development, and in a sense, the approach of most countries has validated and broken the taboo of the traditional thinking that our group has espoused since its creation, that the state has a key and indispensable role to play in promoting development. This is a particularly important recognition, as it has a bearing on a number of interconnected issues, including on the strengthening the voice and the participation of developing countries in international economic decision-making, norm setting, and global economic governance, as called for in Agenda 2030. In a time of threats for multilateralism and a multifaceted crisis, we thus need to keep in mind the need for a strong voice of developing countries at this and other fora. We would appreciate any perspectives that you could share with us on this matter. Once again, thank you very much to both of you, Honorable Mr. Ocampo and the Secretary General, Madam Greenspan, on behalf of our group, for your thought-provoking remarks. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Maimuna. Now I give the floor to the representative of Honduras on behalf of GRULAC.
Muchas gracias. Excelentísimo señor Dr. José Antonio Ocampo, Ministro de Hacienda y Crédito Público de Colombia, Secretaria General de la UNTAC, señora Rebecca Greenspan, Excelencias, distinguidos delegados, señoras y señores. Honduras tiene el honor de intervenir en nombre del Grupo de América Latina y el Caribe, GRULAC. En primer lugar, queremos saludar a la Secretaria General, señora Rebecca Greenspan, y al excelentísimo doctor José Antonio Ocampo, así como a todas las misiones permanentes hoy aquí representadas. Queremos agradecer al doctor Ocampo por su valiosa conferencia. Nuestro grupo considera fundamental que espacios como la Cátedra Raúl Prebisch sean utilizadas para incorporar perspectivas de América Latina y el Caribe al debate internacional sobre desarrollo social y económico. Alentamos, en el espíritu del principio de solidaridad e integración regional, que se sigan discutiendo alternativas y estrategias para enfrentar la actual crisis económica que afecta a nuestros países. Gracias.
Querido embajador, muchísimas gracias por su intervención. Ahora abro la posibilidad de pedir la palabra, de preguntas, de comentarios a José Antonio por parte de todos los presentes en la audiencia. Cameroon, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Secrétaire Générale. Monsieur le Ministre, ma délégation voudrait vous dire tous ses remerciements et ses appréciations pour ce brillant exposé. Je pense que en nous joignant aux propos de la Tanzanie au nom du groupe de 77 plus la Chine, nous traduisons ici notre attachement aux valeurs de développement que vous avez si bien énumérées. Je voudrais pas être plus long parce que votre exposé a été assez dense en fait. Simplement, la question que nous nous posons, c'est celle de savoir est-ce qu'aujourd'hui nous ne sommes pas arrivés, comme on dirait, au bout des paradigmes théoriques. Pourquoi est-ce que nous le disons, monsieur? C'est tout simplement parce que nous avons l'impression que tous les mécanismes de développement qui étaient usités, qui ont jusqu'ici fait l'œuvre d'usage par un certain nombre de pays, sont progressivement en train d'être, je dirais, évacués du champ des pays en développement. Je pense qu'il y a une belle expression qui est souvent utilisée ici, c'est « kicking the ladder ». Vous avez, par exemple, parlé de l'industrialisation par la propriété intellectuelle, l'industrialisation par la production. Et nous savons aujourd'hui que le concept de propriété intellectuelle, tel qu'il était il y a 30 ans, n'est pas le même aujourd'hui. Et que l'usage qui en a été fait dans le cadre de l'industrialisation de ces pays-là ne peut plus être aujourd'hui usité par nos pays. Et ce d'autant plus que vous avez aussi parlé du concept, par exemple, de l'industrialisation. Aujourd'hui, le principe d'une production qui est l'économie est passée d'une économie de services à une économie de production. Et cela se voit aujourd'hui. Je parlerai de production versus distribution. C'est-à-dire aujourd'hui, il s'agit plus de produire. Mais la plus grande difficulté aujourd'hui, c'est de distribuer. Parce que le nombre de barrières ou des obstacles techniques au commerce sont tellement grands que vous pourrez produire en masse, mais il serait difficile en fait d'y avoir accès. Et les concentrations s'y prêtent. Et je voudrais à cet effet peut-être prendre deux exemples. Par exemple, dans l'industrie automobile, si on se rend compte dans les 10 dernières années, il n'y a pas eu de nouveaux acteurs dans ce secteur, ainsi que dans l'aviation. Il y a plutôt une grande concentration. Et que les seuls nouveaux acteurs qui ont émergé ont été dus en fait au déploiement ou bien du boom dans ces marchés-là. C'est-à-dire l'industrie automobile de la Chine et l'industrie automobile de l'Inde, qui est d'abord rattaché à leur marché, ou l'export aujourd'hui aussi lié à l'expansion aux relations économiques qu'ont ces pays avec un certain nombre d'acteurs. Donc pour nous, je voudrais poser la question de savoir, est-ce que vous ne pensez pas que la seule fenêtre qui s'ouvre aujourd'hui aux pays en développement, c'est la coopération sud-sud? Moi, j'ai visité votre pays et j'ai été frappé des similitudes entre la Colombie et le Cameroun, en termes de landscape, en termes d'ingénieurs, en termes de techniques, par exemple, de construction. Je prends un domaine, par exemple, que je connais très bien, qui est celui de la construction du bambou. Vous avez aujourd'hui le plus grand architecte, Simon Bellès, qui est d'une grande renommée. On a vu ce que dans cette économie, comment l'apport de l'ingénierie de la Colombie, aujourd'hui, avec celle de la Chine, sont aujourd'hui en train de façonner cette industrie. Est-ce que la seule fenêtre, même en termes d'export, parce qu'aujourd'hui, si le Cameroun veut construire des voitures, il serait plus difficile d'exporter en Europe que de l'exporter en Colombie, de par les règles de marché, de par les normes de marché. Est-ce que vous ne pensez pas qu'aujourd'hui, la seule fenêtre qui s'ouvre à nous et qui existe encore, c'est une coopération sud-sud et la régionalisation? Merci.
The state of Palestine.
Thank you, Madam Greenspan, Secretary General of UNCTAD. Very good afternoon, Your Excellency Minister Ocampo of Colombia, Excellencies and dear colleagues, distinguished delegates, my friends. Thanks to the Secretariat for convening this excellent lecture. Many thanks, Your Excellency Minister Ocampo, for your presentation, and warm welcome to you in Geneva. We are lucky to listen to you today, recalling all the past development policies and actions and the future vision. Indeed, we are living an economic crisis since a long time ago, 2019, and its impact on our development policies and strategies, creating deep inequalities, distribution problems and supply chains disruption, tax competition, debt issues. My question is, how can we, the developing countries, strengthen in an effective manner the actual multilateral negotiations to allow solving this malfunctioning development machinery and acting together? I thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see anybody else. So, José Antonio.
Well, let me start by thanking both Cameroon and Palestine, but also the previous statements by the G77 and the GRULEC. And let me say on the question of Cameroon that certainly South-South cooperation is a very important topic. Furthermore, regional cooperation for me has always been at the center of a good policies. I think the basic problem is that sometimes some of these corporations are institutionally very weak. For example, the Latin American integration processes have broken down frequently in many ways. So how to build a strong institutional capacity. I mean, you can contract those processes actually with your European Union, which is a strong institutional process. So I think one of the major issues is how to develop South-South cooperation. By the way, also between groups, but let's say, but in that regard, I think there are opportunities, but also strong institutional limitations. So, you are perfectly correct that South-South cooperation has to be enhanced, including, in my view, much stronger regional cooperations, both in Latin America, in the Caribbean, of course, in Sub-Saharan Africa, your region, as well as in Asia, although in Asia probably with different blocks of countries. Now, my answer to Palestine is, of course, that developing countries should be at the center of proposals to manage many of the risks that I mentioned at the end for the current crisis. let me say, whatever you can think about. I mean, we're discussing today. I mean, let me just remind me some of the issues that I find very important. Tax cooperation. You know, in my view, the OECD agreement was very weak for developing countries. So we need an agreement that takes into account. Actually, in the meeting of finance minister convened by India as now the chair of the G20, one of my remarks was that India should lead a second round of negotiations in OECD to manage a much better way the limitations that this agreement that was adopted 2 years ago had for developing countries. That's one topic. The issue of countercyclical financing is very important, and particularly the role of multilateral development banks. I think developing countries should be very strong on the enhanced roles of multilateral development banks and the capitalization that they require. Some developed countries, again, are very reluctant, in particular, to finance middle-income countries. I think that's a major mistake. I think they should support all groups of developing countries, and they should be strongly capitalized. Let me say that the World Bank, for example, played a very important role during the last year. But that was, or even during the COVID-19 crisis, but that was because it had been capitalized in 2019. And that generated the capacity. But for example, in my region, the Inter-American Development Bank, which has not been capitalized, is facing major constraints to be able to enhance its financing for Latin American and Caribbean countries. And finally, this issue of debt. I think of course, UNCTAD has been at the center of that and of this of proposing solutions to this problem, and it should be. And the United Nations in general has played a role because the Secretary General himself has made some statements in this regard. But we have to find out debt mechanisms that work and that facilitate the renegotiation of several debts. By the way, one group of alternatives is actually to enhance the swap mechanisms of different character, particularly, I would say, debt for climate swaps, or I would prefer to call them debt for nature, as they were called in the past. By the way, those mechanisms can be very useful. For example, in Latin America, there is now this joint initiative between Colombia and Brazil to support the reconstruction of in a sense, reforestation, but also the conservation of the Amazon forest. For example, that could be a good mechanism by which developed countries could support that policy to support the Amazon.
Thank you, José Antonio. Now I give the floor to the representative of Argentina. The floor is yours.
Gracias, ministro, y bienvenido. Es un placer tenerlo aquí. Hay interpretación. Hay interpretación, ¿verdad? Sí. Es un honor tenerlo aquí, sobre todo en este día, en un momento clave para nuestra región, cuando mañana tendrá lugar en Buenos Aires la cumbre de jefes de Estado de la CELAC, y estimo que muchas de las cuestiones que usted mencionó también serán allí tratadas. Bueno, tal como usted lo mencionó, haciendo referencia a Davos, estamos en un momento de policrisis, o también aquí llamamos las 3 Cs, el problema del cambio climático, el conflicto y lo que nos dejó el COVID, la situación que nos dejó y aún estamos atravesando por la pandemia. Y en este estado de situación, y siendo que pareciera que ya se ha llegado a todos los límites que podían llegarse dentro de la arquitectura financiera internacional concebida en Bretton Woods para dar soluciones que nos lleven a un desarrollo inclusivo. Queríamos preguntarle, usted recién creo que casi que lo contestó, cómo los bancos multilaterales de desarrollo y regionales pueden contribuir a superar estas crisis, en su opinión. También en cuanto a su propuesta para reestructuración de deuda, nos interesaría saber en qué ámbito o en qué organización imagina que se podría llevar a cabo esa propuesta. Y bueno, aquí hemos tenido también a fin de 2022, en el marco de UNCTAD, la conferencia de deuda y también la reunión del grupo de expertos sobre financiamiento para el desarrollo, donde se conversó de todas estas cuestiones y también, por supuesto, de qué medidas y qué políticas se pueden reformar en el Fondo Monetario Internacional. Me gustaría, sobre la cuestión, conocer su opinión sobre la política de sobrecargas del FMI, si pudiera ser. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Le doy la palabra a Honduras para intervenir en su capacidad nacional.
Muchas gracias. Quizá un poco reiterativo con lo que recién preguntó mi colega de Argentina. Solo quisiera saber específicamente, con su experiencia, ministro, qué expectativas deberíamos de tener los países que integramos la Comunidad de Estados Latinoamericanos y Caribeños, el CELAC, de cara a esta reunión que justamente comenzará en unas horas, partiendo del hecho de que una gran cantidad de países en Latinoamérica ha apoyado esta iniciativa como una fuente, podríamos decir, única y diferente para buscar la cooperación entre los países de Latinoamérica y el Caribe. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, embajador. Le voy a dar la palabra ahora a el staff de UNCTAD que ha pedido la palabra para intervenir. Primero le pediré a Janvier, después a Ono y después a David Vivas. So, Janvier, where are you?
I'm here. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Ocampo, for this enlightening lecture. You have spoken about the context through which many developing countries went through, trying to develop their economies. You have, for example, spoken of the balance of payments dominance and the industrialization consensus. But since Prebisch and Singer highlighted the challenges many commodity-dependent developing countries went through in the 50s, export diversification and industrialization has eluded many of those countries, especially in Latin America, as you said, and in sub-Saharan Africa. My question is, what are your views about the future? Now we have a future that is defined by climate change, by energy transition. What are your views on the chances of these countries to be successful in the coming decades if they haven't been successful in the past? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janvier. Ono?
Thank you, Your Excellency, for this excellent presentation, which I think gave a very comprehensive overview about the development thinking in the last decades. My question is mainly of statistical nature, but please don't be afraid. We are used to speak about the developing countries and the developed countries. So two different groups. In our reports, we show developing and developed countries. We have graphs. In our graphs, these countries pop up. And also in our statistical databases. But over the last 10 years, these concepts have been increasingly questioned. For example, in 2016, Bill Gates, he made the point, he said, the terms developing and developed countries have outlived their usefulness because given the progress which we see in many developing countries over the last decades, in 2014, the World Bank decided, or they claimed, they would like to drop the term developing countries from their World Development Reports. But since then, the term has always still popped up. Last year, UNSD stopped actively promoting the group, the categorization between developing and developed countries as part of the M49 classification of countries. And in UNCTAD, as you well pointed out, UNCTAD took a lead in the past, or it was the basis in the past. The 4 lists in the first UNCTAD conference formed, in fact, the basis of our understanding of developing and developed countries over the past. In 2029, the Republic of Korea claimed they wouldn't like to be treated as a developing countries anymore, but as a developed countries. And this was agreed in the Trade and Development Board in 2021 that they, as the first time, they moved in their list. So the question is, what do we do with these concepts? Do you think they still apply, or does it make sense anymore to distinguish? When we look at the data, we will see it is indeed still countries. We have big differences between the countries when we look at individual development indicators, but this progress across indicators is less and less correlated. So this is also a reason why the different classification schemes applied by different organizations do not match anymore. Then we have new approaches coming up beyond GDP, and I come to my end. So what do you think, how could this be, how should this be treated? Should we still speak about developing and developed countries, or could we think about a new way of defining them? Thanks.
Thank you. David? Vivas?
Gracias, Secretaria General, por organizar esta magnífica lectura. Gracias, doctor Ocampo. He leído muchos de sus papers y investigaciones y son fantásticos. Quisiera tomar el punto que hizo el delegado de Camerún con respecto a la cooperación sur-sur. Quizás es importante mencionar que existe un instrumento del G77 que está administrado por la UNTAC como secretaría, que es el Sistema Global de Preferencias entre Países del Desarrollo, el famoso GSTP de sus siglas en inglés. Este acuerdo es importante mencionarlo porque el día de hoy, si algunos no lo saben, el gobierno de Brasil acaba de depositar su instrumento de ratificación. Felicitaciones, Secretaria General. Felicitaciones, Brasil. Necesitamos un país más, uno más. Y menciono los países que están en la lista, Marruecos, Egipto, Indonesia, Paraguay, para que entre en vigencia el único acuerdo interregional sur-sur, con reducciones hasta 22% en aranceles. Sin embargo, esto es el principio. Esta plataforma, que tiene una excepción bajo la cláusula del abuelito en la OMC, es decir, no necesita otorgarse en formato de nación más favorecida, puede abrirse a expandir la capacidad de producción y de comercio en sectores que están esencialmente cerrados en muchos países desarrollados o industrializados. Básicamente, productos agrícolas, productos agroindustriales, productos agrícolas no de alimentación, textiles naturales, y todos los productos industriales que sí ahí hay un mercado más abierto, pero que tenemos un potencial de construcción de cadenas de valor, que son todos los productos necesarios para promover y aumentar la capacidad de energías renovables en el sur e integrar las cadenas de valor sur-sur. Mi pregunta es, ¿este tipo de acuerdos al día de hoy, dadas las complejidades de las crisis, no es una puerta importante que tenemos que considerar para fomentar las capacidades de producción y también de absorción de nuestra propia demanda en el sur? Gracias, doctor Ocampo.
Muchas gracias, David. Le doy la palabra al representante de Irán. Iran, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for giving me the floor. At the very outset, let me join the friends in the hall, and I appreciate your glorious presence, Mr. Minister. And also I would like to express my appreciation to Madame Crispin and her colleagues for the excellent arrangements of this valuable meeting in which we see galaxy of thoughts are together. Thank you. Just maybe that might be repetitive, but during your reach lecture, you hinted at the role of the technology and technology transfer. Though everybody recognizes, the importance of the technology transfer, but even in practice, we see that technology access is under question, and this does not come true because of so many elements that I'm not gonna open it up here because it's time consuming and it's out of the timing. What would be your proposed for the developing countries with the situation given the challenges that Your Excellency mentioned? And also I would like to bridge to World Economic Forum in which the Director General of the World Trade Organization brought up the new issue of the decarbonization of the global value chain and the production, whereas the developing countries are deprived from the technology that fits, the issue in question. And last, in nutshell, if you would be in your previous position in the ECLAC, if I'm not mistaken, what would be your proposal for the strategic cooperation of the G77 and China, let's say South-South cooperation? I thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you so much, Iran. And the last intervention is a written question from the University of Geneva, Simone Grote. And it says, could you please comment on the prospects of a common currency suggested by the Lula government and the estimated effects on boosting regional trade and reducing US dollar dependency?
Bueno, quiero comenzar respondiendo a los comentarios de representantes de Argentina y Honduras, y lo hago pues en mi propio idioma. Digamos, en primer lugar, deseo los mayores éxitos en la reunión de CELAC, que tendrá lugar allá en Argentina. Y si, digamos, obviamente, digamos, espero que allá salgan buenas conclusiones y buenas recomendaciones. Pero, digamos, si yo puedo resaltar un tema importante, es realmente la fortaleza del regionalismo, de la cooperación regional, de la integración regional, que es un tema que ha fallado una y otra vez, incluyendo en la región que usted representa, el Mercosur. Digamos, porque digamos, el proceso de Mercosur no ha tenido siempre la consistencia, pero lo mismo en la región nuestra, en la comunidad andina o en la centroamericana, que curiosamente puede ser la más consistente en términos de continuidad. Pero digamos, yo diría el fortalecimiento de los procesos de integración, incluso las nuevas dimensiones de la integración, que no han sido exploradas. Por ejemplo, como académico, yo he participado en muchos proyectos de ciencia y tecnología de la Unión Europea, en cuales los centros de ciencia y tecnología europeos trabajan conjuntamente, incluso, digamos, contratan, si se quiere, o participan otros académicos de otras partes del mundo. En América Latina no hay un solo mecanismo de cooperación regional tecnológica. Ese es un área que me parecería interesante. Cooperación en materia de salud pública, que es una área de creciente importancia. el tema que ha sugerido, de hecho, el presidente de Colombia de una integración energética latinoamericana, incluso para promover energías limpias. O sea, todos son áreas de cooperación, pero aparte de los viejos temas de cooperación, el comercio, que es un tema, el financiamiento, a través de nuestros bancos regionales de desarrollo. En fin, todos son dos temas que yo diría que deberían estar en el centro y ojalá, digamos, estos procesos latinoamericanos sirvan y caribeños sirvan para lanzar nuevas formas de, digamos, el fortalecimiento de nuestra propia cooperación regional, o sea, la integración. En fin, obviamente los otros temas, algunos de los cuales también se refirió la delegado de Honduras, digamos, son muy importantes. Este tema, digamos, del papel de los bancos multilaterales de desarrollo, que es un tema que yo resalté y que quiero volver a mencionar como un tema que es absolutamente esencial. Digamos, en el caso, digamos, latinoamericano, tenemos, de hecho, 3 bancos multilaterales a los cuales podemos acudir y hay uno para la región centroamericana, y que son todos de una gran importancia. Eso, digamos, el crecimiento de esos bancos a través de una buena capitalización, el diseño de sus nuevos instrumentos financieros, el apoyo, por ejemplo, a todas las políticas de cambio climático, entre muchas otras, digamos, que se pueden hacer. Eso para mí es muy importante. El tema de la reestructuración de deudas, no como tema regional, sino como tema mundial, además porque depende mucho del país. O sea, hay países que lo necesitan, hay países que no lo necesitan. Por eso tiene que ser un programa caso por caso, para que aquí exista un mecanismo al cual los países que lo necesitan puedan acudir. Y puedan acudir oportunamente, que es un problema serio de todos los procesos de reestructuración de deudas, que a veces llegan demasiado tarde. En fin, esos son temas que son muy importantes. Digamos, sobre el Fondo Monetario Internacional, digamos, obviamente el Fondo Monetario podría ser sede de un mecanismo institucional de reestructuración de deudas, como se propuso en el 2001-2003, en debates que tuvieron lugar y que fracasaron. Pero siempre y cuando las partes que median o toman decisiones en materia de reestructuración de deudas sean independientes del directorio del Fondo Monetario, o sea, que sean realmente instituciones independientes. En fin, podría ser allá, podría ser en Naciones Unidas. En fin, ese es un mecanismo, como digo, yo he propuesto uno que sería ad hoc, pues, o sea, para manejar la coyuntura actual, que está de hecho en algunos escritos que he hecho, que sería un mecanismo para que en caso por caso los países puedan ir a un mecanismo que sería manejado por los bancos multilaterales de desarrollo. Entonces sería como intermediado por los bancos multilaterales y ellos, digamos servirían para mediar, para servir de mediador con las entidades que son acreedoras del país respectivo, tanto públicas como privadas. En fin, es un mecanismo que y en el cual el banco, pues obviamente no, digamos, facilita de pronto financiamiento adicional para que haya para apoyar el acuerdo. Eso podría ser el mecanismo que yo he sugerido, pero podría haber otros mecanismos, pero realmente el mundo necesita ya un mecanismo para manejar los problemas de exceso de deuda de varios países desarrollados y en desarrollo. Me refiero también a la última pregunta sobre esta propuesta brasileña, que de hecho tuve la oportunidad de escucharla de parte del ministro de Brasil, ahora en Davos. Sobre ella yo diría que primero no es una moneda común, estrictamente hablando. Digamos, no es el euro, no es un euro latinoamericano, ¿no? Es una moneda que serviría para un instrumento, una moneda respaldada por todos los países que sea de carácter internacional. O sea, uno puede pensar que en América Latina tenemos un instrumento que ha funcionado bien en algún momento. Por ejemplo, funcionó de manera excelente la crisis de la deuda, que son los sistemas de pagos entre bancos centrales, en lo cual, digamos, si un país latinoamericano, digamos, comercia con otro país latinoamericano, los pagos se pueden hacer en moneda nacional, ¿no es cierto? En moneda nacional, y entonces se generan, digamos, cuentas de los bancos centrales que, digamos, median, que dicho sea de paso, tiene también una tradición europea, porque fue el mecanismo que se creó después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial para facilitar la creación de comercio entre países europeos. En fin, o sea, entonces, digamos, eso podría ser sustituido por una moneda, digamos, que compartamos todos, ¿no es cierto? Una moneda, como no una moneda común, sino una moneda respaldada por todos, pero que no sería la moneda de ningún país, sino un sistema de pago adicional, y me parece que ahí puede haber es un sistema de pago regional. Eso me parece una buena propuesta, hay que discutirla en su, digamos, cómo se adoptaría. Más aún, yo incluso le propuse al ministro brasileño que podría ser manejada por el Fondo Latinoamericano de Reservas. Digamos que es un fondo del cual ya somos miembros 8 países, y que dije que invitaba a Brasil a unirse al Fondo Latinoamericano de Reservas como un primer paso en esa dirección. De hecho, sea paso también a Argentina, espero que se nos una, y México y muchos otros países que no son hoy parte del Fondo Latinoamericano de Reserva. Es nuestro propio fondo monetario regional, que ha tenido muchas virtudes para todos los países miembros. Ha sido un excelente instrumento, incluso digamos, manejó mucho mejor que cualquier otra institución la crisis latinoamericana de la deuda, entre otros procesos. Entonces, ahí sobre eso, let me shift again to English to answer some of the other questions. On climate change, I really hope there is a breakthrough in both in the funding through different mechanisms, which could include, first of all, meeting the goals of the fund to support climate change policy of developing countries, the $100 billion fund that was anyway, that was, but also, for example, the increasing support by multilateral development banks for climate financing, including, very importantly in that case, for adaptation and not only for mitigation, because many countries are facing serious adaptation problems. And swaps, debt for nature, debt for climate swaps as a mechanism. Perhaps we could be creative and develop new instruments. Anyway, that has to be a major breakthrough in the policies. Now, the question whether developed versus developing country categories are good, I do think, of course, there's a growing differentiation among developing countries. That is not it's not recent, it has taken some time. Actually, in a paper I wrote many years ago, I talk about the dual divergence, the divergence between developed and developing countries, and the divergence among developing countries. By the way, so there is a growing heterogeneity of developing countries, but still, I think there are common interests and that among developing countries that should continue. Well, this institution, UNCTAD, was created at the initiative of developing countries as a forum where developing countries could enhance the reforms of the international economic system. And I think that is still correct. There are many issues in many areas which there are north-south divergence or developing country divergence, and I think it makes sense for those institutions and therefore for the criteria. Of course, but when you want to measure you have actually other alternatives, actually by level of income, for example, or by the level of human development, or you could think of different alternatives, but I think the categories do make sense in terms of the negotiation processes in the multilateral economic system. The issue of South-South cooperation, and this instrument, the SGP for trading, I think that's a very interesting issue. I was not too conscious of that. I'll actually even find out where my country has signed the agreement. But I am not conscious, but I'll find out. Now, the issue of technology access raised by Iran is I think, of course, an essential issue, and it has to do with many issues that are on the agenda today with the UNCTAD people, but also with the Colombian team, for example. We discussed the issue of intellectual property rights, and whether we need changes in the system of intellectual property rights, which is, of course, a topic that is at the center of the agenda here, both in UNCTAD, let's say, in WIPO, and of course in WTO. So and how to improve the technology transfer is I think a major issue. But also, and maybe may I underscore this also in relation to my comments on Latin America, on our own capacity to do research and development and innovate, which is, of course, a major issue for developing countries. They have to, as I pointed out in my lecture, developing our own science and technology systems has to be very important, and to invest in science and technology. I mean, just let me in that regard emphasize one is a very important point. China, let's say 2 decades ago, invested in science and technology a minor share of its income. Now it has the same level of investment in science and technology as an OECD country. In contrast, in Latin America, the only country that invests more than 1% of GDP, which is, and it still is about half of the level of an OECD country, is Brazil. The rest of Latin American countries invest, much less than 1% of GDP. I think you have to make a commitment to build your own science and technology system. And then, as I point out, for Latin America, systems of cooperation in science and technology among countries as part of our own integration process. And let me say in that regard, there are also room for South-South cooperation. For example, given the growing role of China in the generation of technology policies, there can be, or even if Korea doesn't consider, the Republic of Korea doesn't consider a developing country, Korea can be a good partner for many of us. For example, Colombia's relations with Korea are excellent, and there are Korean investments which could be interesting. But there also, India can be a major player, of course, in that world. And anyway, Brazil certainly, in Latin America, and many other countries, but so to enhance cooperation among countries. I said my proposal for several years has been that we have to develop an integration system in which science and technology is part of the integration process. That has been done by the European Union. It should also be done by developing countries in their own integration process, and probably as part of the South-South cooperation.
Unfortunately, we really don't have time for more questions. I will ask Indira Romero to forgive us and Diego Valadares, but I will give you the possibility to talk to José Antonio online. So I'm sorry, we have to wrap up because the cocktail is already ready. And I want to invite you all to continue the conversation with José Antonio, maybe in the cocktail, so maybe Diego and Indira will have that opportunity while we all go to the mezzanine. So thank you all very much. Thank you for the translators for helping us, and for all of you for participating in this Raúl Prebisch lecture that has been so interesting, so important, and so inspiring. So José Antonio, thank you so much for being with us.